This morning. Father, we love you so much for who you are. We come before you, God, believing in your victory. We come before you, God, proclaiming it. Proclaiming it because our hearts need to go through the discipline of speaking about your victory. Proclaiming it because we want to be a people who are able to hope for others. So for those who are hurting in the room this morning, God, I pray that as we speak about your great love and your great victory, we can believe for them, can speak hope for them. Father, we ask you, God, to continue to instill in us your Spirit so that we might be grateful of all things. Father, as we begin this week celebrating what changed the world, God, I pray that our hearts are open. I pray that our minds are ready to learn and to hear and to understand. And I pray, God, that our hearts are formed so that we might act with kindness and compassion. That we might truly internalize your great faithfulness so that we might be able to see above the brokenness of this world and to rest assured that the new creation is on the way. In your Son's holy name I pray. Amen. So we are entering into the last sign that we see in the Gospel of John. Over the last several weeks, for the last 6 weeks, we've looked at these signs that John talks about, these miracles that get special attention in John. And there are 7 signs that lead up to the resurrection. And so this morning, even though it's Palm Sunday, I'm actually going to be speaking about the resurrection of Lazarus. And we're going to talk about that for a little bit. To be honest with you, I'm not going to call it resurrection so much as I'm going to call it a resuscitation. And I'll tell you about that in just a minute. But there are these 7 signs. There are these 7 moments when heaven breaks into earth and God shows us what is coming. God shows us what Jesus is about. And this was prophesied if you go all the way back to John chapter 1 when Jesus looks at Nathanael and he tells him, what you're going to see is heaven open up. When the ministry of Jesus gets going, when the ministry of Jesus takes its full effect in everything that's taking place over those 3 years, you see heaven opened up and the beauty of God's eternal kingdom comes down and he shows us, this is who I am, this is what the kingdom is about, and this healing is what's on the way. And we get to sign number 7. The moment when we see death for what it truly is. And it's been pretty crazy, no offense as far as the journey goes. The journey has been pretty crazy just simply because if you go back to the first sign, and some of you were more excited about this than others, Jesus turned water into wine. I know who you are. And we were you just see this like Jesus keeps a party going because what Jesus wants people to understand is that when God is in their midst, when the goodness of God is seen, we feast and we have great joy. And what is coming is the eternal conversation that surrounds the feast when everything is made right. And you see healings along the way where all of these things that have seemingly been this, well, it's just too much for us to overcome. Christ looks into our life and Christ speaks into our life and he shows us, now there's nothing too much for me to overcome. And now the most prominent sign that we get in all of John's gospel is this story with Lazarus. I'm going to read beginning in verse 1 of John chapter 11, and I'm going to read quite a bit here, just simply because I want to make sure you grasp the totality of the context. Now a man was sick, Lazarus from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair, and it was her brother Lazarus who was sick. So the sisters sent a message to him, Lord, the one you love is sick. When Jesus heard it, he said, this sickness will not end in death, but it is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha, her sister, and Lazarus, so when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. Then after that, he said to his disciples, let's go to Judea again. Rabbi, the disciples told him, just now the Jews tried to stone you, and you're going there again? Aren't there 12 hours in the day? Jesus answered. If anyone walks during the day, he doesn't stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks during the night, he does stumble because the light is not in him. He said this, and then he told them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm on my way to wake him up. Then the disciples said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will get well. Jesus, however, was speaking about his death, but they thought he was speaking about natural sleep. So Jesus then told them plainly, Lazarus has died. I'm glad for you that I wasn't there so that you may believe, but let's go to him. Then Thomas, called Twin, said to his fellow disciples, let's go too so that we may die with him. And I'm not going to lie to you, this is one of those other moments in John that I find a little bit funny. Can you imagine if no one called you Thomas, no one called you by your first name, and we're just like, hey, Twin? You know? I mean, this is just one of those funny moments to me. That's like being like, this is what I kid you not, this happened, and this is probably going to make my parents mad. My dad once introduced me as this is Matt, that's my brother, and this is his brother. Like, that's what it's like to be Thomas all the time. Hey, Twin. No one knows your name. Hey, Twin, come here. Thought I would point that out because Thomas gets 2 moments. He gets 2 total moments in John. He gets called Twin, and then we know him as Doubting Thomas. His story needs to be redeemed. Somebody needs to help him out here. All right? Let's keep reading. When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been dead in the tomb for 4 days. Now, one of the things you should know about this is that when people died, they buried them on the same day. Okay? So I just kind of want you to hear that. That's part of the process. They buried them on the same day. Bethany was near Jerusalem, less than 2 miles away. Many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them about their brother. And as soon as Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Then Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Yet even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. Your brother will rise again, Jesus told her. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me, even if he dies, will live. Everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Look at this confession. Yes, Lord, she told him. I believe you are the Messiah, the Son of God who comes into the world. Having said this, she went back and called her sister Mary, saying in private, the teacher is here and is calling for you. As soon as Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw that Mary got up quickly and went out. They followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to cry there. As soon as Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and told him, listen to the language again, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her crying and the Jews who had come with her crying, he was deeply moved in his spirit and troubled. Where have you put him? He asked. Lord, they told him, come and see. And Jesus wept. So the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, couldn't he who opened the blind man's eyes have kept this man from dying? Isn't it interesting that Jesus is so polarizing that every single time there is, look at the love of God, look at the greatness of who God is, and then on the flip side there are those going, okay, this guy can do miracles and he can't save Lazarus, and then at the cross we hear, hey, if this guy is truly God's king, can he save himself? You see here the questions and the polarizing effect, and then you get to this point where Jesus shows up at the tomb, and he's moved again, and he's worried about all the things that are taking place, and he sees all of the hurt that's happening, and he's troubled, and he's sad again, and so he looks up into the heavens, and he tells God, thank you so much for what you are about to do through me, and he tells him to roll the stone back, and everybody's worried because Lazarus has been dead for 4 days, and so they're telling him, hey, if you roll the stone away, the stench that's going to come through there it's too much for us. They do it anyways. And then God's word comes through Jesus, and he speaks, and here comes life. Lazarus walks up out of the grave. Now, there are a ton of things to take from this, and there's a few things I want to point out just from the text so you kind of see what's going on. I find it really interesting that as the messenger gets to Jesus, his response is to wait 2 more days. That's just weird. Because there's a part of you that looks at Jesus and you're like, you just got a message, okay? And some of you have heard this before. Some of you have seen this before because I've gotten text messages or emails or I've gotten phone calls from some of you because somebody in your family or some loved one is really, really sick or really, really hurt. And they may even, and this has happened since I've been here, on their deathbed, and I get a phone call because some of you want me there immediately. I get that feeling. And yet here is Jesus getting that same call, that same message, and his response is, we'll get there in a couple days. And he stays wherever he's at. And then he decides, okay, fine, it's been a couple of days. We don't have any idea what Jesus is doing. And he decides to go. And even before he gets a chance to go, his guys look at him and they're like, Jesus, that's where people want to kill you. That is less than 2 miles from Jerusalem. We already know they're after Jesus. They want to stone him. And interestingly enough, this city of Bethany that he has to go to, the way that you translate Bethany, its literal meaning is the house of the poor. And I don't believe that's a detail John wants us to miss. From the house of the poor, they are crying out for help. And so God goes to them. And as he gets there, or as he gets close, Martha comes running to him. And by this point, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. And that's a very significant number, especially in popular Jewish perspective. Excuse me, hello. I don't know what that was. If I die here in a moment, somebody help, okay? I don't know what's happened there. It's burning in my chest, though. I may be dying in front of you. I don't know what just happened. All right. Back to Jesus. So, I don't know where I'm at. Okay, here we go. Popular Jewish thought, 4 days he's been dead in the grave. Interestingly enough, one of the beliefs amongst Jewish history and Jewish thought is that the spirit of the person would hover around the body for 3 days. And so here is the belief in their perspective that our loved one has just passed away, and for these 3 days, his spirit has just been hovering around this body, basically hurting over death. And by day 4, the body has started to change, and their perspective was by day 4, the spirit has left. And it is one of those finalizing moments for them. And that's the day Jesus shows up. And Martha, just like Mary, just like you and I sometimes, we look at Jesus and in the midst of our pain and we're like, God, if only you had been here, you would have fixed this. If only you had been in our midst, if only you had been attentive, if only you, God, hadn't been so distant, we wouldn't have to go through this. And Jesus tells her exactly very similar the conversation that he gives in John chapter 9 to the disciples. Based upon what you're seeing right now, you're about to see something great. You're about to see something divine. This happens so that God's glory might be revealed. For her, it's interesting because as she questions Jesus, his response is, you know that he's not really dead, right? I mean, you know he's going to live. And her response is, it's very telling. I know Jesus. I know the faith. I know that in the last day he's going to receive a resurrection, but that doesn't help me in my grief now. And so he tells her, you do know who I am, right? I am the resurrection. I am the life. And as the story keeps going, he has this same, very similar interaction with Mary, and yet as he's having this interaction, and he sees all of the grief, all of the pain, all of the crying, Jesus gets frustrated. And the literal language there is that Jesus got angry. He was angry. He was frustrated and he was troubled in his inner soul at what was taking place in front of him. So they take him to the grave, and here comes Lazarus. Brings him out. And if you caught what I said earlier, I want you to see this is not so much a resurrection as it is a resuscitation. Simply because Lazarus is going to die again. What I didn't read for you is the Jewish response that takes place just after this. Because this is easily the most prominent sign that Jesus is some sort of king, that he's doing some sort of something special, because the Sanhedrin, this group of Pharisees and Sadducees, this group of prominent spiritual leaders, they come together and they are discussing Jesus, and they're discussing what they have to do. And the nervousness that they have is, okay, we are already peasant slaves, basically, to Rome. And so if there is this uprising and there's this king, and all of a sudden, and we saw this just a few chapters ago, 5,000 men want to make Jesus king by force, because they're basically thinking, we have a military-style king, and we're going after the world. We're going to bring Israel back to its government political prominence. And the Sanhedrin is worried. Because if there's too big of an uprising, Rome's going to come in. And they had this special deal that was seemingly worked out with Rome, where they were taxed, they were basically slaves, but they were also, because they were such a small country and they weren't really that big of a threat, they were basically just kind of, okay, don't cause any trouble, and we'll let you kind of have your stuff. And basically, Herod played some sort of like taskmaster for Rome. That's why the Jews didn't like him. And Caiaphas, the high priest, begins to speak because everybody is so worried. And do you know what he talks about in front of the Sanhedrin? As they're talking about killing him off and this whole great uprising and everything that's taking place, Caiaphas' response to everybody that's sitting here in the Sanhedrin, he talks to them and he goes, do you understand that his death will be of great advantage to Israel and to the rest of the world? Very interesting. Because what Caiaphas sees is if we kill him off, we can keep the status quo. We can keep our place over Israel. We can keep our place and not have too much conflict with Rome. The status quo remains unchanged. Let's just kill him off. And here is God almost laughing in the background going, you go ahead and do that. Because as you kill off my son, the status quo changes for eternity. That's how I usher in the kingdom. Now, as I mentioned last week with John chapter 9, there are several things we could wrestle with in the text. Could probably do 3 or 4 weeks of sermons just coming out of this one chapter. But I want to give you a couple things to think about today. The first of which, and it's one that I have wrestled with in the past, and it's one that I want us to wrestle with today, and it's been something that's kind of been eating at me throughout this week, just to be honest with you, is the emotionality of Jesus. Like, that's not the side of God we tend to see a lot, you know? I mean, even when we get to the end of the week with Passion Week, the idea that Jesus is on his knees and that his tears and his sweat are like blood. And Jesus the Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane is begging God, don't make me do this. We'll talk about that a lot. And here is Jesus seeing very close friends of his go through and have to deal with the repercussions of sin and death in this world, and he gets angry. And he weeps. And here's the question that I've been wrestling with, and I want us to wrestle with. Why? What is it that makes Jesus so angry? What is it that makes Jesus so frustrated? What is it that brings Jesus to a point where he weeps? Remember this, he already knows he's going to raise Lazarus. So why is he so worked up? I heard it explained once that the reason Jesus was so worked up and the reason that Jesus wept was because he saw their lack of faith and it drove him crazy. I don't buy into that. I think he's weeping because he understands and he's getting a first-hand, intimate picture into what death does to people. I think he's angry that evil gets this type of power. I think he weeps because he sees people that he deeply loves have to deal with death and evil and the repercussions of sin, and it infuriates him to a point that he just can't hold it in. And the crazy thing about this is, the connection that I've had to ask myself over and over and over throughout this week is, what makes me angry, and are they the same things that make Jesus angry? Am I angry about evil? Am I angry about fear? Do I weep and cry over people who are hurting and going through all sorts of horrible things? Do I get frustrated and emotional about those things? Or do I demonize people? Am I angry at people? Am I angry and do I weep over ideologies? Or am I angry and am I frustrated about the power of death and fear in our world? And I don't think they're the same thing. And I think Paul would tell us later on they're not the same thing. Remember what Paul tells them at the end of Ephesians, this great book that is sent to all of the places. It's the only book not meant for a specific congregation that's going through all sorts of junk. Here is this letter that is passed on. At the end of it, he says, our struggle is not against flesh and blood. Our struggle, our battle, the greatest threat to humanity is not other people. It's evil. It's the rulers and the authorities that try to bring evil into our world. It is the spiritual forces that pervert and destroy God's good creation. And I'm just wondering, am I the type of person who gets angry at people, or can I see below that and get to the root of the issue? And the problem is not the other person who is also made in the image of God. The problem is evil. The problem is evil. And I wonder what it would look like if Christians in the United States decided we're going to view the world, and we're going to see the world through the lens of Jesus, and we're going to treat people not like they're an enemy or dumb or a threat to us. We're going to treat them like people who bear the image of God, and we are going to work against the evil that is perverting the lives of people, not work against people. Second thing, because that view is a view in which we understand death to be the ultimate power in the world. When you believe death and fear are the most powerful things taking place within our world, you demonize people and you work against people. But when you view the world through the lens of Jesus Christ, that death is not the ultimate power, things are way different. And so as we begin making our way to Easter, I want to ask, do we view death in the same manner as Jesus Christ? Did you catch how Jesus views death? He calls it sleep. Think about that for just a moment. I'm going to let that sit. This radically new perspective on suffering and death and life. And Jesus calls death nothing more than sleep. And when Martha is overwhelmed with grief and death, Jesus doesn't point her to the past as though he can restore the brokenness of those types of things. Jesus is like, no, I'm ushering in a new creation where death gets worked into my plan so that through death, through a lengthy sleep, I can bring about new life. Death is falling, death is losing, and love is winning out. And so Jesus points her to the future on the last day when all of God's people are resurrected and they received perfect spirituality, perfect bodies, and perfect restoration for all of creation. Just like last week, and we discussed this a little bit, death is being repurposed into God's grand plan, and so now death is nothing more than a doorway into eternal life. Now let me speak to a couple things here. I understand why we fear death and why we ache over it. And here's what I think one of the biggest struggles is when we understand death in our world today. It is always hardest to be the one left behind. You know? It's always hardest to be the one left behind. And you look at any relationship at any level, whether you are a teenager who is going through your first breakup when you've been dumped, all the way to relationships that don't work out in the midst of our world today, and you feel like someone has moved on and you've been wronged, to where we enter into this conversation of how we deal with death, it is always hardest to be the one who gets left behind. But let me try to put that in a conversation that we get here from Jesus. Think about the new context that Jesus is giving here with death being nothing more than sleep. I think you could make a pretty good argument that the guy that gets the worst of it in this story is actually Lazarus. You know? Because here's this guy who was terminally ill. He passes away. He gets 4 days into his afterlife, and then Jesus speaks life back into him and brings him back out of the grave, knowing he's going to die again, only to be brought back into the world so that the Pharisees can plot to kill him. And if he survives the plot, something else in this broken world is going to kill him again. And there's got to be this moment where he's looking at Mary and Martha like, dude, really? I was there, and you brought me back for this? Thanks for nothing, you know? But that's the Christian view of death now. The Christian understanding when we recognize that death has now been moved into the resurrection life of Jesus Christ, that now death has no power. Death has now been repurposed. That's the best thing that I think we can give to the world today, is that when we consider death, I love the fact that Jesus didn't just get rid of death. He actually forced death to work for his purposes. Think about that for a moment. Not only am I going to defeat you, I'm going to force you to help me accomplish the new creation. That is hope. Which is what we have to, it's what we have to keep telling one another. It's what we have to keep telling the world. Because here are the two different directions that people go in the midst of their grief. You saw Mary and Martha's question. If only you had been here. And the struggle when you enter into grief is that grief denigrates into hopelessness. For a lot of folks. Grief perverts the thing that they are holding on to such a degree that grief denigrates into hopelessness. It denigrates into despair. It's such an easy temptation. And that's why we have to keep preaching the real context. And when I say real, I know sometimes we don't believe it, but it is the real context. And so when you and I enter into grief, and I'll be the first one to tell you, for those of you who don't grieve well, which is America, I mean, they had 7 days when a loved one would die, where they would heavily grieve. And then the cultural context is that you had basically 23 more days to grieve as well. And they would stay away from work, they would stay away from all sorts of things to truly go through a real grieving process. And the way that the villages worked, which is so very interesting to me, is that these people would show up just to grieve with you. They would weep with you, which sounds a whole lot like Romans chapter 12, because the Christian church together rejoices with those who rejoice, and we weep with those who weep. And they had this whole grieving process, and I'm telling you right now, for those of us who bottle things up, that is unhealthy. Okay? It is unhealthy not to grieve. It is unhealthy to internalize it. It is unhealthy not to go to Jesus Christ. And because of the new creation, because of this Jesus Christ who has been raised from the dead, and because he is King of creation, when we grieve into hope. We lean into the future. We grieve into, see, I'm not the only one having problems today. Me and the babies who are burping, you know? But we grieve into, come back to Jesus and be serious, people, come on, okay? We grieve into the goodness of God, because when we look up, we recognize that every single person that we love, every single follower of Jesus Christ has gone to sleep. And we preach the second coming without fail. We grieve into hope. That's who we are. For those of us who can't believe that today, let us do that for you. If you can't believe in the good news, I hope that you will open up your heart to those of us who can, so that we might proclaim for you and to your heart, our God has overcome sin, death, and fear. And we will hope for you as long as it takes. And for those of you who are overcome with sin, we'll hope for you as well. And we'll love. And we will proclaim a God that can bring about any healing, whether it is sin or whether it is fear or whether it is death. I want to invite the band to come back up. We're going to do something that we did last week a little bit. I feel like the last couple of weeks we need to do a little bit of worship kind of coming out of this. We need to sing. And I get it. If you stand next to me, you know I don't sing so well, okay? That's why I stay over here in the corner most days. But we need to sing, and not just sing to God, we need to sing to one another, because there's something that takes place when the voices come together to proclaim God's goodness, that it does a formation inside of us that can't be experienced otherwise. So we've got 2 more songs left, and I encourage you, stand with me, sing, take in the words, and if you can't sing, take in the faith that is being professed next to you. Let's stand.